In the year 1967, the United States found itself at the height of social change, political turbulence, and economic experimentation. And at the very same time, the nation's coinage reflected that turbulence in subtle yet telling ways. The 1967 1-cent coin, known as the Lincoln penny, is one of those small, round witnesses of history that hides inside it a story much larger than its copper surface would suggest. To understand the significance of the 1967 penny, one has to begin with its very design, a design that by then had already been in circulation for almost 6 decades, featuring the profile of the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, created originally by the sculptor Victor David Brenner. In 1909, the Lincoln cent stood out in American coinage because it was the first regular issue coin to depict a real historical figure. Until then, the United States Mint had favored symbolic depictions of liberty. But in 1909, on the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, the Mint decided to honor the great emancipator with his image on the smallest denomination of American money. By 1967, that design had endured through wars, depressions, booms, and technological change. And though familiar to everyone who jingled coins in their pocket, its story was far from ordinary. The mid-1960s had seen a crisis in coinage when the price of silver surged and caused widespread hoarding of coins. People pulled silver dimes, quarters, and half dollars out of circulation, leaving banks and businesses short of change. In response, Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1965, a sweeping reform that not only removed silver from dimes and quarters, but also introduced new alloys for the half dollar. The same law eliminated mint marks from 1965 through 1967 in order to discourage the practice of collectors removing coins from circulation during a shortage. And so the 1967 penny stands as a coin without a mint mark, regardless of whether it was struck in Philadelphia, Denver, or San Francisco. This absence of a mint mark makes it part of a unique 3-year span in U.S. coinage history. The composition of the coin remained traditional in 1967, a bronze alloy of 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc, weighing 3.11 grams and measuring 19 millimeters in diameter. The obverse side carried the long familiar bust of Abraham Lincoln, facing right with the inscriptions "In God We Trust" above his head, "Liberty" to his left, and the date 1967 to his right without any mint letter beneath it. On the reverse was the image of the Lincoln Memorial, introduced in 1959 to replace the earlier wheat ears reverse and chosen to commemorate Lincoln's 150th birthday. The memorial, designed by Frank Gasparo, was highly symbolic because it tied the coin to the monument in Washington, D.C. that had become a shrine to unity and equality. If you look closely with a magnifying glass at the reverse, you can even make out the seated statue of Lincoln between the columns. A remarkable level of detail for such a small denomination coin. The mintage of the 1967 penny was enormous because the mint was fighting against coin shortages. Over 2.9 billion cents were struck that year and distributed widely throughout the nation. This massive production ensured that the coin would remain common in circulation for decades, but while most pieces were destined for everyday use, there were also special issues that stand apart. 1967 was the second year of the Mint's Special Mint Set program, introduced as a temporary replacement for proof sets, which had been suspended during the coin shortage instead of individually polished proof coins. Collectors could purchase special mint sets, which contained coins with a somewhat better finish than circulation strikes, though not quite proofs. These sets included a 1967 penny with sharper detail and smoother surfaces, and today collectors often seek these out as higher quality representatives of the year. The historical setting of 1967 adds further depth to the story of this coin. It was the year of the Vietnam War escalation, when American troops were heavily involved overseas, and the draft was reshaping the lives of young men back home. It was the year of major civil rights struggles, riots in American cities, and the continuing reverberations of the civil rights movement. It was the year Thurgood Marshall was appointed as the first African-American justice to the Supreme Court, a monumental step in the pursuit of equality. And it was the year cultural change surged through music, art, and politics, from the Summer of Love in San Francisco to massive protests in Washington, D.C. through it all. The 1967 penny circulated silently from hand to hand in gas stations, grocery stores, payphones, and candy shops, bearing the face of Lincoln, who himself had steered the nation through its greatest test of unity a century earlier. For collectors, the 1967 penny poses intriguing questions, because though it is common in sheer numbers, condition, rarity, and errors can make individual coins valuable. High-grade uncirculated examples, especially those graded MS-67 or higher by major certification companies, can command strong prices, since only a small fraction of the billions struck have survived without scratches, wear, or spotting. Coins from the special mint sets with deep cameo or ultra cameo contrast are also highly desirable. And then there are error coins, which always stir the excitement of numismatists. 1967 cents have been discovered with off-center strikes, clipped planchets, die cracks, doubled dies, and other striking anomalies. Each of these transforms an ordinary penny into a conversation piece, with collectors often willing to pay dozens or even hundreds of dollars depending on severity and eye appeal. Looking deeper at the cultural meaning of the coin, one can see the paradox of American money. The smallest denomination, often overlooked and even discarded, represents one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history, and in 1967, when the nation was struggling with questions of justice, equality, and national identity, it was Lincoln's face that continued to remind citizens of the unfinished work of democracy. The coin itself was also a tool of stability, helping maintain commerce in a time when people were uncertain about currency availability. Every cent produced contributed to restoring trust in the coinage system. Another important aspect of the 1967 penny's history is its place in the gradual decline of copper coinage. For centuries, pennies had been primarily made of copper, but rising metal prices would eventually push the mint to change the composition in 1982 to a predominantly zinc core with only a thin copper plating. Thus, the 1967 penny belongs to the older, heavier generation of bronze cents, which many collectors today prefer for their durability and aesthetic color. Over time, these coins develop attractive patinas, shades of brown or red, that appeal strongly to numismatists who classify coins by color designations: red, red, brown, or brown, depending on how much of the original mint luster remains. The coin's connection to broader history can be extended further if one considers that every penny is a marker of economic behavior. In 1967, a single cent had purchasing power far greater than today. One could still buy a piece of candy or a gumball for a penny. A newspaper might cost only a dime, and vending machines accepted pennies for combinations with nickels and dimes. The penny was part of everyday commerce in a way that feels almost quaint. Now, when inflation has eroded its practical use, the 1967 penny therefore becomes not just a collector's object, but also a reminder of a different economic era, a time when children might save pennies in jars to buy comic books or baseball cards, when millions of Americans still thought of the cent as meaningful spending power. As a historical artifact, the 1967 penny is thus both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in that billions were made and most circulated without notice. Extraordinary in that it encapsulates a critical chapter of American coinage policy, design, history, economic conditions, and cultural transformation. The story of this coin could fill volumes, because every aspect, from its design to its production to its role in daily life, connects to wider narratives of American identity. So when you hold a 1967 penny in your hand, you are not just holding a small round disc of copper. You are holding the legacy of Lincoln. You are holding the response of a nation to a coinage crisis. You are holding a reflection of the turbulent 60s. You are holding a fragment of history that, despite its humble denomination, speaks volumes about resilience, change, and continuity in the American story. And that is why collectors, historians, and even casual finders of old change continue to study, treasure, and tell the story of the 1967 penny, for within it lies a chapter of our nation's history too important to be forgotten. The story of the 1965 Lincoln penny, also known as the Lincoln Memorial Cent, is one that carries with it not only the history of the coin itself, but also the broader history of American coinage economic challenges, social movements, and technological advances in minting. And it all begins in a decade that was unlike any other, the 1960s, a time when the United States was shifting politically, culturally, and economically, and when the very coins people carried in their pockets reflected both tradition and change. The Lincoln cent had first been introduced in 1909 as a celebration of the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, and it was the first widely circulating American coin to feature the portrait of a real historical person rather than an allegorical figure, and this alone marked a turning point in the way Americans thought about the symbols on their money. And by the time we arrive at 1965, the Lincoln cent had already become an everyday fixture, a coin everyone used daily, and yet its design, its composition, and its role in society were in flux like never before. To understand the 1965 penny, one must first understand the coinage crisis of the early 1960s, because America was facing a shortage of silver, a shortage of coinage, metals, and an unprecedented demand for coins due to booming commerce and population growth. Silver coins like dimes, quarters, and half dollars were being hoarded by the public as silver prices rose, and the United States Mint was struggling to meet demand. Banks and businesses were reporting shortages, and Congress began debating how to reform the nation's coinage system, and in 1965, sweeping changes were enacted. The Coinage Act of 1965 eliminated silver from the dime and quarter and reduced the silver content in the half dollar. The new clad coinage system was born, and while the cent was not made of silver, its production was tied to the overall needs of the mint. The cent had been composed of 95% copper and 5% zinc and tin since the mid-19th century, and that composition held through 1965. But the mint was under enormous pressure to reduce backlogs, to streamline production, and to prevent hoarding. One decision made during this period which directly affected the 1965 penny was the temporary removal of mint marks from all coins. From 1965 through 1967, mint marks were deliberately left off to discourage collectors from pulling coins out of circulation. The government believed that coin collecting was contributing to the shortage, so for 3 years, no coin carried a mint mark, which is why the 1965 Lincoln cent has no mint mark. Regardless of whether it was struck in Philadelphia, Denver, or San Francisco, it became a coin stripped of its identity in a way, and yet that anonymity itself makes it historically significant. When you hold a 1965 penny, you are holding the product of a federal policy designed to change public behavior and address a nationwide crisis. But beyond that historical policy context, the coin itself retains the artistry and legacy of its designer Victor David Brenner, whose portrait of Lincoln first appeared in 1909. Brenner's design featured Lincoln in profile, facing right, modeled after a photograph taken by Matthew Brady, and it was originally paired with 2 wheat stalks on the reverse from 1909 until 1958. But in 1959, to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, the reverse was redesigned by Frank Gasparo to feature the Lincoln Memorial, and thus, the 1965 penny bore this updated reverse design, showing the monument in Washington, D.C., a powerful national symbol itself. The tiny statue of Lincoln can even be seen between the columns if one looks closely, making it one of the only circulating coins in the world to depict the same person on both the obverse and reverse. The technical specifications of the 1965 penny remained consistent with earlier years. It weighed 3.11 grams, had a diameter of 19 millimeters, and was struck in bronze, a mixture of copper, zinc, and tin. But what stands out is the mintage. The mint struck an astonishing 1.5 billion cents in 1965, making it one of the largest mintages of its time. Yet despite such high numbers, the penny of 1965 is far from worthless to collectors today, because condition varieties and historical context elevate its importance. One must remember that these coins were minted under the cloud of transition shortages. And experimentation in that backdrop makes high-grade examples, proof-like strikes and errors, especially desirable to numismatists. The proof coins of this era deserve special mention. The United States Mint had suspended traditional proof sets from 1965 to 1967, instead issuing what were called special mint sets. These sets were intended to reduce the strain on the mint, while still providing collectors with high-quality examples. The 1965 Special Mint set, Lincoln Cent, is therefore unique. It does not have the deeply mirrored finish of traditional proofs, but rather a satin-like finish that distinguishes it from regular circulation. Strikes these coins are often collected as a separate category, and they embody the experimental spirit. Of mid-60s, coinage errors too are part of the legacy of the 1965 cent, with some examples showing striking errors off center strikes, die clashes, and doubled dies, each of which tells its own story of how a coin passed through the complex machinery of the mint and escaped quality control to land in the hands of an observant collector. And in the numismatic marketplace, such errors can transform an ordinary penny into a piece worth hundreds or even thousands of dollars beyond the technical details. Though the 1965 penny is a window into the social fabric of its time. This was the era of civil rights marches, the escalation of the Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, and the cultural upheavals that redefined what it meant to be American. Money was both a constant presence and a symbol of national identity, and at the very lowest denomination, the penny linked people of all walks of life, whether they were buying a newspaper, dropping a coin into a vending machine, or saving change. For their children's piggy banks, it connected them to the history of Lincoln, to the economic realities of the 1960s, and to the policies of the federal government in a way few other objects could. Examining the 1965 penny through this lens allows us to see how numismatics is not just the study of metal discs, but the study of history, economics, politics, and culture wrapped into one small object. When a collector today seeks out a 1965 Lincoln Cent, in uncirculated condition, perhaps graded MS-65 or higher, they are not just looking for perfection of strike or luster, they are seeking a tangible link to the past, a moment in history when the nation was navigating change, and the coinage reflected that tension. The Lincoln Cent has always been a people's coin, accessible to everyone, and yet capable of holding extraordinary value depending on condition, rarity, and errors, and the 1965 issue sits right in the middle of that tradition, abundant in raw numbers, but full of nuance in its details. As the decades passed, millions of 1965 pennies were worn down through circulation, others were lost to time, while still others were preserved intentionally or accidentally in roll sets or collections. Today, when we encounter one, we should not see it simply as a piece of copper, but as a story of American resilience and adaptation in coinage, the penny that was stripped of its mint mark during a national shortage, the penny that carried the image of a president who preserved the Union and the image of a memorial built to honor him, the penny that survived decades of circulation, and yet still invites us to look deeper into the fabric of American history. Imagine holding in your hand a small copper coin minted in 1953, a wheat penny, whose face value was just 1 cent, but whose story stretches across generations of American history, economic change, artistry in coin design, and the subtle mysteries of numismatics. This is not just a penny. It is a window into the post-war era, a time when America was finding its footing after World War II, when prosperity was rising, but also when global tensions of the Cold War were beginning to shape the world. The wheat penny of 1953 tells us about how coins were made, the metal they were struck from the mints that produced them, the artistry of Victor David Brenner, who first designed the Lincoln Cent in 1909, and the enduring symbolism of wheat, ears that represented American agriculture strength and growth. In those years, every coin in circulation carried a message far greater than its face value. The story of the 1953 wheat penny begins with its design. On the obverse, we find Abraham Lincoln, The beloved 16th president immortalized on the cent since 1909, the Lincoln cent was the first U.S. coin to bear the portrait of an actual person, breaking away from the classical allegories of liberty that had dominated coinage for over a century. Brenner's design placed Lincoln facing right with the word liberty to his left and the date to his right above him, the motto, "In God We Trust," which had been appearing on coins since the Civil War era. What makes this coin iconic is the reverse, with its two simple wheat stalks, one on each side, framing the words 1 cent and United States of America, along with the motto E pluribus unum. This wheat design would last until 1958 before being replaced in 1959 by the Lincoln Memorial reverse. But beyond the design lies the real depth of history. The 1953 wheat penny was minted at 3 locations: Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco. Each mint left its own small mark of history. Philadelphia coins carried no mint mark. Denver pennies bore a D, and San Francisco pennies, and S collectors today seek out these varieties not only for their differences, but for their relative rarity. The Philadelphia Mint produced over 256 million coins. Denver struck more than 700 million, while San Francisco produced a more modest 181 million. In total. Over 1 billion wheat pennies were struck in 1953, which speaks to the incredible demand for small change in post-war America. The metal content of these coins is another layer of their story, struck in 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc. These coins carry within them the last full era of copper cents, before the dramatic changes of the 1970s and 1980s, when rising metal costs would lead to pennies being made primarily of zinc. The feel, weight, and tone of a 1953 cent speaks to an earlier age, when coins carried substance, when every clink in the pocket resonated with real metal. The historical backdrop of 1953 adds even greater meaning. Dwight D. Eisenhower was president. The Korean War had just ended, the Cold War was heating up, and the American economy was booming. Suburban expansion, consumer spending, and industrial growth were reshaping the nation. Coins were everywhere: vending machines, buses, corner stores, pay telephones. All required pennies, nickels, and dimes. In those years, the penny still mattered. It could buy a stick of gum, a piece of candy, or contribute to a gallon of gasoline, costing just 29 cents. When we study a 1953 wheat penny, we are not only studying metal, but also the daily life of millions of Americans. For collectors, the value of the 1953 wheat penny varies dramatically depending on its condition, while most circulated examples are worth only a few cents to perhaps $1. Pristine examples, uncirculated with full red luster, can fetch far more, especially those certified by grading services like PCGS or NGC. And then there are errors and varieties which make certain 1953 cents worth hundreds or even thousands of dollars, doubled dies, repunched mint marks off center strikes, or coins struck on the wrong planchets. All are treasures waiting to be discovered in Rolls jars or family coin boxes. The artistry of the wheat penny design also invites deep reflection. The choice of wheat ears as the central motif was not accidental. In 1909, when Brenner created the design, the United States was still a largely agricultural nation. Wheat represented prosperity, nourishment, and growth. It was a symbol the average citizen could connect with. By 1953, though the country was shifting toward industrialization and urban living, yet the coin still carried that agricultural legacy, as if to remind Americans of their roots. As we dig deeper, we can look at the transition that followed just a few years later. In 1959, when the wheat reverse gave way to the Lincoln Memorial, this marked the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth and signaled a new direction in coin design. The 1953 wheat penny thus sits near the end of an era representing the last chapter of the beloved wheat design. Collectors cherish these coins not only for their copper glow, but for their place as one of the final wheat issues. Even more fascinating is how these coins circulated. They traveled in the pockets of soldiers returning from Korea, factory workers, suburban families, children saving coins in piggy banks. They were exchanged in diners, jukeboxes, laundromats, and corner stores. Every scratch and mark on a circulated 1953 penny tells a story of everyday American life. To truly appreciate the 1953 wheat penny, we must also consider the broader numismatic tradition. The Lincoln cent has been in continuous production for over a century, making it the longest-running coin design in U.S. history. When you hold a 1953 cent, you are touching part of that legacy, part of a series that has endured longer than any other in American coinage history. This little coin connects us to art, politics, economics, and the ordinary lives of people decades ago. It teaches us how to see coins not just as money, but as historical documents, tiny works of art and enduring artifacts of culture for the collector, for the historian, for the curious soul. The 1953 wheat penny is a treasure not for its rarity alone, but for the story it carries from the heart of mid-century America. The year was 1945, a year that carried the weight of both victory and devastation, a year that marked the closing chapter of the Second World War and the beginning of a new global order. And yet in the middle of this monumental year of history, the United States Mint quietly produced a coin that would become a piece of everyday life and also a marker of that era's spirit. The 1945 Lincoln wheat cent. This humble 1-cent piece, minted in Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco, was struck at a time when the United States stood at a crossroads between wartime sacrifice and peacetime rebuilding, and in every way the 1945 wheat penny tells a story of America's resilience, its economy, its culture, and its people. The obverse of the coin continued to feature the enduring profile of Abraham Lincoln, a design first introduced in 1909 by Victor David Brenner to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, and by 1945, this portrait was more than just a likeness. It had become a national symbol, one that Americans looked upon daily in their pockets as they endured. Rationing, worked in factories, supported soldiers overseas, and prepared for life after the war on the reverse. 2 simple wheat stalks framed the words, 1 cent United States of America, flanked by E pluribus unum, meaning out of many one. This design represented both simplicity and strength during an age when every ounce of copper, every moment of labor, and every resource had to be carefully allocated to support the war effort. But by 1945, something important had changed for the wheat cent for 3 years. From 1942 to 1944, the mint had experimented with alternative metals for the penny because copper was needed for ammunition shell casings and other wartime materials. In 1943, the famous steel penny was struck, a coin with a zinc-coated steel core that looked silvery and unusual compared to the traditional bronze cent. By 1944, however, the mint returned to a primarily copper-based composition, using recycled shell casings from military stockpiles, and so the 1945 wheat penny belongs to that period of wartime and post-wartime metallurgy. It is composed of 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc, though in reality, most 1945 cents were closer to being 95% copper and 5% zinc. Because tin supplies were extremely limited, this detail matters because collectors today can trace how the war not only changed the appearance of coins, but also their physical makeup. And when you hold a 1945 wheat cent, you are holding a coin whose copper may have once been a shell casing used on the battlefield, reminding us that even the smallest coin carried within it the echoes of global conflict, the mintage figures of the 1945. Penny also tell us a great deal about the time in Philadelphia. The main mint produced more than 1 billion of these coins, an enormous number that reflected both the booming American economy at the end of the war and the need for circulating currency as millions of soldiers returned home and re-entered civilian life in Denver. The mint struck over 266 million coins, and in San Francisco more than 181 million. All told, the 1945 wheat cent is one of the most common wheat pennies of the era, yet despite its abundance, the coin is cherished by collectors not simply because of rarity, but because of context. It stands as a snapshot of a single pivotal year. The year the war ended, the year the atomic age began, the year millions around. The world breathed both relief and uncertainty. It is a coin that connects pocket change to world history. When we examine the Philadelphia issue, we find that the absence of a mint mark on the coin does not diminish its historical value. It is the sheer volume of Philadelphia's production that shows us the industrial might of the United States. During that period, the Denver issue carries the familiar D beneath the date, reminding us of the Rocky Mountain Mint that had become a powerhouse of wartime coinage production, while the San Francisco S marked coins tie us to the West Coast and to a mint facility that had been crucial not just in making coins, but in supplying the Pacific theater economy with currency. If we step back and consider the artistic side of the 1945 wheat cent, we see Victor David Brenner's design still crisp, still emblematic of early 20th century ideals. Brenner's Lincoln was not just a portrait, but a statement about democracy, integrity, and leadership. His initials VDB had caused controversy in 1909 when they were first placed on the reverse and later removed. But by 1945, collectors and the public alike had accepted his artistry as one of the most enduring in American numismatics. What makes the 1945 wheat penny even more fascinating is the way it circulated through everyday American life. Pennies like these paid for newspapers in the morning. They bought candy and soda for children. They dropped into jukeboxes at the local diner. They were stacked into rolls at banks across the nation. They found their way into church collection plates and soldiers' pockets, and for many families of the 1940s, these coins were a constant companion in a time of both hardship and hope. As the war ended in Europe in May of 1945, and in the Pacific in August of that year, coins like the 1945 wheat penny were spent in celebration, in mourning, and in rebuilding the everyday rhythm of life. The collector of today sees not just a common bronze coin, but an artifact of that time frame. Collectors also study the variations in strike quality between the mints. Philadelphia coins often display sharper details because of the higher mintages and fresher dyes. Denver and San Francisco issues sometimes show weaker strikes or differences in luster, but these small variations become significant in the hands of a numismatist who seeks to connect every detail of the coin to the history of its making errors. To play a role in the story of the 1945 wheat penny like doubled die, obverses, repunched mint marks, and off-center strikes, which can elevate an ordinary cent to a prized rarity within a collection. And here again the history deepens. For these errors were not merely accidents. They were the natural byproducts of a mint working at maximum capacity during an age of industrial strain, when the demands of production sometimes outpaced perfection. When you expand the lens further, you see that the 1945 wheat penny sits at the end of an era, because in just a few years, by 1959, the reverse design would change from the wheat ears to the Lincoln Memorial, reflecting a shift in both style and national identity. So this coin is part of the last great generation of wheat cents, which today are treasured for their link to a different America. To tell the story of the 1945 wheat penny is to tell the story of a nation at a turning point. And that is why collectors, historians, and everyday enthusiasts alike continue to search for these coins in circulation in estate sales and in old family jars. They are reminders that history is not only written in textbooks or in monuments, but in the smallest everyday objects that passed from hand to hand silently, recording the triumphs and tragedies of their time. The 1945 wheat penny is therefore more than a cent, more than copper, more than a design. It is a bridge between the hardships of war and the promise of peace, between the sacrifices of the greatest generation and the aspirations of those who came after it. Is a story you can hold between your fingers, a story of America at its most determined, most tested, and most triumphant.